beyond the horizon of the Greek mainland. A massive army and fleet of ships to match had gathered, the likes of which the Greek world had never seen before. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing several decades later, claims that over 2.5 million men were present from all nations of the known world. Today, we simply don't know the actual size of the invasion force, though modern scholars tend to estimate the number closer to somewhere between around 100,000 and 200,000 men. Still a massive force. This was the Grand Army of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Quite simply, the most powerful state that had ever existed in the history of the world. And in many respects, Herodotus was quite right. This force didn't consist of Persians alone, not by a long shot. To name a few, those present were Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Judeans, Egyptians, Bactrians, Scythians, Sogdians, Lydians, Cushites, even Indians from the far-off eastern edge of the known world. Together, these were the subjects of a colossal land empire, stretching from the deserts of Libya in the west to the Indus River Valley in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to at least the first cataract of the Nile in the south. Many of these contingents of soldiers fought on behalf of their own local rulers, the same elites who still governed their kinspeople at home. Yet, in truth, above all, there was only one king who really mattered. A king of kings, the Shahanshah, who sat on the Persian throne. In 480 BC, that man was Xerxes, son of the mighty Darius the Great, one of the greatest administrators in history, and grandson of Cyrus the Great, the warrior lord who'd brought the world to its knees.
With his charisma and what the Greeks called the fear he inspired and the terror he struck in all men, Cyrus took control of more and more territory. In just 30 years, he laid the foundations of an empire that would stretch from the borders of India in the east, to Greece on the Mediterranean, down to Egypt and Ethiopia, and up to what is now Russia. More than 30 different peoples were brought together under the rule of the man who called himself the King of the World. And at the heart of this empire stood Persepolis, the greatest of all Persian cities, and the key to understanding the achievements of the ancient Persians. Persepolis was begun around 515 BC by Darius the Great, the fourth king in the Persian dynasty known as the Achaemenids. But much of what we can see today lay hidden under the sands for 2,000 years.
Figures in profile, lines of people wearing very different costumes, exotic animals, gifts coming from the most remote corners of the world, ivory tusks, pottery, textiles, and lion skins. When archaeologists digging at Persepolis first beheld these bas-reliefs, they were puzzled. Why depict so many different peoples from such distant lands in one work? But slowly, clues fell into place that gave scholars the answers. The people with the ivory tusk and the okapi are Ethiopians. The dromedary is typical of the Arabs. That pointed headdress clearly belongs to the Shiites. The Assyrians are portrayed with a cart, and here are Indians with a donkey. 23 nations in all carved into this stairway, representing the first great empire in history, the Persian Empire, and the many peoples who converged on its capital.
The city of Persepolis became the greatest city in the Persian Empire.
Persepolis is an amazing site. It includes a complex of palaces, audience halls, fortifications, and other buildings, all built on a huge platform, 4 times as large as the Acropolis, carved on the lower slopes of a mountain.
Persepolis. Built 2,500 years ago, it was known in its day as the richest city under the sun. Persepolis was the capital of the largest empire the world had ever seen.
While living in Jerusalem, the prophet Isaiah gave an unusual prophecy. A prophecy that specifically identified the name Cyrus, Persia's first king many years before he was born.
Now Isaiah lived about 700 BC, and Cyrus does not come onto the scene until, roughly speaking, 150 years later. Isaiah the prophet remarkably predicted that the Lord would use a future king of the Persians named Cyrus, Kurush, whom he calls the Anointed One.
Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I have also called you by your name. I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me.
This phrase, anointed one, is extremely important. It means Messiah and is typically connected to kings. When Isaiah calls Cyrus the Messiah, there's no ritual behind it. A flask of oil wasn't poured over his head, but it's a metaphorical use, meaning that this is a person whom God is going to use for a special purpose in his plan.
This is the only time in the scriptures where a non-Israelite is called the Messiah of God, the anointed of God.
This whole land will become a desolate ruin, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years.
How would a return home be possible under the mighty grip of the Babylonian Empire? According to the Hebrew Bible, King Cyrus, called the Anointed, and the Messiah of God would change everything. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus issued a decree that completely changed the way kings rule conquered peoples. And that foreign policy would begin to open the way for God's promise of blessing to the world to be fulfilled.
In 1879, a clay foundation cylinder with cuneiform writing on it was found amongst the ruins of ancient Babylon. Written shortly after his conquest of Babylon, the text of the cylinder tells how Cyrus was the chosen agent of Marduk, sent to bring peace and justice to the land.
Cyrus was the first king in history that allowed the people that he had conquered to worship God in the ways that they wanted to.
Today you can visit the United Nations building in New York and see a copy of the Cyrus Cylinder, which is actually a replica of the original in the British Museum today.
In the Bible, it talks about how Cyrus gives permission for the Jews to return to Jerusalem and commissions them to rebuild the temple. And this is an amazing and important thing and part of God's plan.
I am Cyrus, King of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world. Son of Cambyses, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, descendant of Thespes, the great king, king of the city of Anshan. My vast troops were marching peaceably in Babylon, and the whole of Sumer and Akkad had nothing to fear. I sought the safety of the city of Babylon and all its sanctuaries. As for the population of Babylon, I soothed their weariness. I freed them from their bonds. Marduk, the great lord, rejoiced at my good deeds. I sent them back to their places, to the city of Ashur and Susa, Akkad, the land of Eshnuna, the city of Zamban, the city of Meternu, Dur, as far as the border of the land of Guti, the sanctuaries across the river Tigris, whose shrines had earlier become dilapidated, the gods who lived therein and made permanent sanctuaries for them. I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. And the gods of the land of Sumer and Akkad, which Nabonidus, to the fury of the Lord of the gods, had brought into Shuana. At the command of Marduk, the great lord, I returned them unharmed to their cells, in the sanctuaries that make them happy.
ساعت 11:20 بامداد روز سه‌شنبه 20 مهر ماه 1350 پاسارگاد ایران. اعلی حضرت همایون شاهنشاه آریامهر، اولیا حضرت فرح پهلوی شهبانوی ایران و والا حضرت همایون ولایت عهد همکنون به پاسارگاد تشریف فرما شدند و در جایگاه مخصوص نزول اجلال فرمودند. ملتی بزرگ با سرافرازی و شادمانی فراوان 2500مین سال بنیانگذاری شاهنشاهی خود را جشن می‌گیرد. آفتاب درخشان ایران مانند همیشه فروزندگی ویژه‌ای دارد. سکوت و انتظاری خاص در پاسارگاد فرمانرواست. آرامگاه کوروش بزرگ در این سکوت و انتظار بیش از همیشه شکوهمند می نماید. اینک شاهنشاه آریامهر به سوی آرامگاه کوروش گام برمی‌دارد. نسیمی که نرم نرم می‌وزد پرچم‌ها را به اهتزاز می‌آورد و به این سکوت جذبه‌ای توصیف ناپذیر می‌بخشد. اکنون ساعت 11:30 بامداد است. دلها در سینه ها می‌تپد. لحظات به سنگینی می‌گذرد. لحظاتی سرشار از سرافرازی، لحظاتی لبریز از شور و هیجان. در این لحظه تاریخی نه تنها مردمی که در پاسارگاد گرد آمدند، بلکه همه جهانیان مشتاق آنند که بدانند چگونه شاهنشاه آریامهر از نخستین بنیانگذار شاهنشاهی ایران، کوروش بزرگ هخامنشی تجلیل می‌فرمایند.
کوروش، شاه بزرگ، شاه شاهان، شاه هخامنشی، شاه ایران زمین، از جانب من شاهنشاه ایران و از جانب ملت من بر تو درود باد.